Good morning and welcome. Today we'll be talking about AMSCO Chapter 16 for AP European History. AMSCO Chapter 16 is titled Nationalism, Revolutions, and Internal Stability. It's basically from 1848 until around 1900 or so, focusing on the politics, the development of new national ideologies, the unification of Germany, Italy, mass politics, etc. So you can kind of see where we're headed. There's going to be two different sections to it. Part one will focus on 1848 to 1871, the dissolution of the Congress of Vienna and the unification of Germany and Italy that proceeded from that. And then part two, we'll talk about nation states from 1871 on, focusing on Eastern Europe and then mass politics in Western Europe. So again, part one focusing on 19th century nationalism, really 1848 to 1871. Like always, it's helpful to think about the context of this time period. So 1848, well, you should instantly think, okay, 1848, there was a wave of revolutions throughout Europe. Now, I want to go back even farther. 1815, that was the Congress of Vienna. Congress of Vienna was held after Napoleon's defeat, and the Congress of Vienna restored monarchs and conservatism and stability in Europe. And for the next 30 years or so, they were relatively successful in suppressing revolutions. But by 1848, revolutions, and I'm going to say these revolutions are inspired mostly by nationalism and liberalism, threaten the Congress of Vienna. They threatened this stability that had been put in place in 1815. So again, Congress of Vienna was able to successfully suppress revolutions in 1830, 1848, mostly, although these revolutions are continuing, and these people are being inspired by liberalism because they want more rights. They're being inspired by socialism because workers want a job and food and fair prices. And these revolutions are inspired by nationalism. The people want to unite as one stronger nation, basically everything except for conservatism. And so by, you can see this map here that shows where the revolutions are. They're almost everywhere. They start in France, but they spread all throughout the German states, the Austrian Empire, Italy, etc. So by 1848, there are cracks in the Congress of Vienna. There are cracks in the conservative order. Clemens von Metternich, actually the foreign minister of Austria, has fled the country, but the Congress of Vienna is still hanging on by a thread. That thread is finally going to snap, and the conservative order, the stable order, is finally going to collapse in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, there was what was called the Eastern Question. It was the Ottoman Empire. Let me see if there's a map here. Yeah, this shows the Ottoman Empire here. It's modern day Turkey, I guess, but it also spread throughout Middle East and North Africa as well. The Ottoman Empire had been falling apart for centuries, really. They were actually nicknamed the sick man of Europe. I mean, there's a couple of political cartoons from the time period depicting the Ottoman Empire as a sick old man on his deathbed. And everybody basically assumed the Ottoman Empire was going to collapse. It was inevitable that they were going to collapse. And so the question was, when they fall, when the Ottoman Empire falls, how is that going to upset the balance of power? Because ever since Napoleon had been defeated because of the Congress of Vienna, there was stability, there was a balance of power. So the big question is, again, I'll label this the Eastern Question. That was what it was nicknamed. When the Ottoman Empire collapses, how will that upset the balance of power? Now, there had been some small revolutions in this region, specifically in 1821. Greece rebelled to gain their independence. Greece is right here. They were part of the Ottoman Empire. Greece had rebelled to gain their independence. But the war that will finally break up the Ottoman Empire is a dispute over land, basically. Now, there's all sorts of little details. It was a conflict over religious territory and who controlled religious territory. But what it really came down to is Russia up here saw an opportunity. And Russia figured, okay, Ottoman Empire is about to collapse. Russia starts to sneak in there, starts to creep in there to kind of put their flag markers down to claim this land. As Russia does that, the other members of the Congress of Vienna, remember there was the big five, England, France, Prussia, Russia, Austria. The other members start looking at Russia and thinking, well, if they get this land, they're going to be too powerful. So as Russia puts a claim to the land, England and France end up declaring war. So the Crimean War is basically caused because Russia tries to take land from the Ottoman Empire, and this leads to England and France declare war, worried Russia will be too powerful, I guess. This leads to the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856. The Crimean War itself is kind of interesting because it's the first modern war. It's the first war after the Industrial Revolution. So there are railroads to resupply soldiers. There is some medicine on the battlefield. There are cameras and journalists who are cataloging and journaling what's happening here. So the Crimean War was quite brutal. And all of this was captured on film, or at least on photograph. In the end, by 1856, the war is over and Russia loses. Russia has to give up their claim to the land. And the land is basically split up amongst kind of the big five. The real big effect of the Crimean War, though, isn't the redistribution of land. What really happens is the old Congress of Vienna, it was called the Concert of Europe, all five countries working in concert or working together. That falls apart because these old allies, England, France, Prussia, Russia, Austria, they just fought a war against each other. So the effect of the Crimean War is that the Concert of Europe falls apart. Russia, they just lost a war. They were humiliated. They withdraw. And they think to themselves, okay, we just lost this industrial war. We've got to rebuild. We've got to build up our economy. Meanwhile, England kind of retreats from international affairs. They're disillusioned with war. They basically thought like, well, why should we go to war? I don't want to go to war anymore. We just fought this brutal war for 3 years. And so the Crimean War is important because the Concert of Europe falls apart. There is now no one there to suppress revolutions. From 1815 to 1848, whenever there was a revolution, England would swoop in, or France would swoop in, or Austria would swoop in to suppress those revolutions. Now that no one is there to suppress these revolutions, this opens the door for successful revolutions, for people to rise up to upset the balance of power. And that's specifically going to happen in Germany, and then a little bit less so in Italy. So I'm going to bold a couple of lines here. Crimean War, the most important thing of the Crimean War is that the Concert of Europe falls apart. That opens the door for people to have these rebellions. So Germany is the first big state, or sorry, Germany is the most important state who takes advantage of the collapse of the Concert of Europe to unite. Now, a little bit of context first. Remember, in 1848, there was no country of Germany. In fact, Germany was instead 38 different states that made up the German Confederation. You can see Prussia was the most powerful German state, but there was Bavaria, there was Bohemia, Saxony, etc., etc., etc. Now, in 1848, there were attempts to unite Germany. They created a trade union called the Zollverein that allowed the 38 German states to freely trade with each other, helped them to industrialize. And also in 1848, as revolution swept across Europe, the German states held a meeting called the Frankfurt Assembly, where they asked the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, to become King of Germany. In 1848, he refused. He basically thought that that would put a big target on his back, and it would maybe threaten his power, threaten Prussia's power. He wasn't quite ready for it. But still, by 1848, there are early attempts to unite Germany, but all of them have failed so far. So by 1848, several attempts to unite Germany have failed. I'll just put a couple of those key terms in there. Zollverein, that was the trade union, and then the Frankfurt Assembly, that's when they asked the King of Prussia to become the King of Germany. Things begin to change in the 1860s and 1870s with a new leader called Otto von Bismarck and a new idea called realpolitik. Realpolitik is basically, I'm going to bold this because it's a super important key concept. Realpolitik is basically the idea that when you're fighting for things, the only thing that matters is power and money. So you should basically, if you're a leader, you should do whatever is going to give you more power, whatever is going to give you more money. Fighting for justice and freedom and liberties, that all sounds really cool, but it doesn't actually matter. So just causes like liberty and equality are not enough. So only power and money matter in politics, not justice or freedom or something like that. And so what this basically means is that Otto von Bismarck, who's the German prime minister essentially, he goes to war not to give Germans more freedoms, not to create a democratic republic where all Germans have the vote. No, he goes to war to make Germany more powerful and therefore to make himself more powerful. This is a concept we're going to explore when we dig into a DBQ on Bismarck. This is something called conservative nationalism. Conservative nationalism takes two ideas that we've already talked about. Conservatism, maintaining stability, traditional sources of power like monarchs, and nationalism, strengthening the nation, and putting them together. Conservative nationalism says you should use war and you should use monarchs to strengthen your nation. And so this is a really fascinating manipulation of these old ideas. Nationalism is normally associated with liberal ideas, and yet Otto von Bismarck takes advantage of that for his own benefit. And so we'll see over the next couple of slides how Bismarck uses war, uses conservative nationalism to unite Germany. Again, he does it through war. From 1866 until 1871, I'm going to put 1871 here for when Germany unites. Bismarck uses war to unite Germany. And Bismarck basically realizes that in order for Germany to unite, he's got to take advantage of Germany's two biggest enemies, Austria to the south and France to the west. And so what Bismarck does is he provokes a war with both of his enemies. He provokes a war with Austria and he provokes a war with France. He intentionally starts it at a moment when he knows that he's got the advantage. The Austro-Prussian War in 1866, Bismarck and the German states relatively easily defeat Austria. They kick Austria out of the German states. And Bismarck gains more power, gains more popularity. Some German states kind of join his cause. And then 4 or 5 years later, in the Franco-Prussian War, he defeats France to the west. They win some land called Alsace-Lorraine, which is this tiny little border piece right there. All of the southern German states join up with Bismarck's cause. Not only have they defeated their biggest enemies, France and Austria, but now all the German states have rallied to Bismarck's leadership, I guess. So what I'm going to put here is that Bismarck provokes war with Austria and France to, first to defeat Germany's main enemies, and then to unite Germans. There's not much that unites people more than war against a common enemy. Bismarck knows that. He knows how to inspire nationalist feelings in the people through war, through a common enemy. And he uses that nationalism to create a conservative state, to create a conservative empire. And so there's Bismarck kind of whispering to people, hey kid, want to unite the German states under one flag? Yeah, the Germans are all in on that. And by 1871, Germany has been united as an empire, not just as a monarchy, but as an empire. They're crowned at Versailles. That's the French palace, remember? He actually forces the French king to place a crown upon their new emperor's head, Kaiser Wilhelm I or Kaiser William I. France is forced to give up a whole bunch. They're forced to pay a bunch of reparations or damages to Germany. France is forced to give up Alsace-Lorraine. That's this border territory that France is going to go to war to try to win back 50 years later in World War I. And then France gets rid of their king, Napoleon III, that we'll get to later. And so Germany unites in 1871. I want to kind of really hammer home a couple of points here. First, Germany is able to unite because the continent of Europe fell apart after the Crimean War. Nobody was there to swoop in and suppress this revolution. Remember the big five: England, France, Prussia, Russia, Austria. Prussia is the one who's going to war. They become Germany. They defeat Austria. They're out of the way. They defeat France. They're out of the way. Russia's out of international affairs. They're trying to rebuild. England, they've withdrawn from international affairs. So there's no one in Europe to stand in Germany's way. And Germany is able to very quickly, within half a decade, 5 years, Germany is able to unite. And this will eventually upset the balance of power, because Germany is going to become the European superpower by 1914, when World War I begins. So I'll just do a little foreshadowing here. This will eventually lead to World War I, which we'll get to in due time. So Germany unites through conservative nationalism. I'm going to bold this idea of conservative nationalism. I'm also going to bold Bismarck's name. A lot of key terms in there that we'll deal with a little bit later. Just to the south, Italy also unites as one nation, kind of following the same playbook that Bismarck and Germany did. So Italy, same thing. Remember, Italy had been a collection of city-states all the way back to the Renaissance and beforehand. Italy was a collection of city-states. Austria controlled some of the states in the north. The Pope controlled Rome and the Papal States. The Bourbons, who were the French, they controlled some pieces along the French border. And so Italy was not united. It was a patchwork of a bunch of different states controlled by different foreign powers and whatnot. Now, just like in Germany, there were attempted revolutions in 1830 and 1848, inspired again by liberalism and nationalism. But just like all the other revolutions, those early revolutions failed. They were suppressed, remember, because of the concert of Europe. But again, once the Crimean War breaks up the concert of Europe, once those big five, England, France, Prussia, Russia, Austria, once they're no longer working together, that opens the door for Italy to rise to power. Let's throw all of that in here. And so Italy unites kind of with two different approaches that kind of merge together. There's unification from below, and there's unification from above. Unification from below means, well, the lower social classes, the people, the working classes are rising up. This was led by Giuseppe Garibaldi, who was a worker, leader of the working class, and he led a peasant revolt and a worker revolt. Quite conveniently, because it's a revolution from below, he's uniting the southern Italian states. So this is a revolution led by, hopefully I spell his name right, Giuseppe Garibaldi and the workers. And the goal here is to create a republic. So if you think about our different isms, what is Giuseppe Garibaldi motivated by? He's motivated by liberalism, to create a republic where all working class people have the vote, have a voice. and he's being motivated by nationalism to unite Italy. So I'll just add that here. This is motivated by liberalism and nationalism. On the flip side, there's also unification from above. Now, literally, they're starting in northern Italy and moving their way down. And metaphorically, this is the top of the social class. This is the monarch going to war. So it's led by the King of Sardinia, which was a northern Italian state through war. And the goal here was a monarch, still a united Italy, but a monarch. Which isms is that? Well, that's conservatism because they want a monarch, but it's still nationalism, trying to unite Germany, trying to unite Italy, just not in a republic, but as a monarchy. And so this political cartoon kind of illustrates what ultimately happens. You've got King Victor Emmanuel of Sardinia here. You've got Giuseppe Garibaldi down here. What is Giuseppe Garibaldi doing? He's down on one knee. He's putting the boot, they're not very subtle, literally putting the boot onto King Victor Emmanuel's foot. As Victor Emmanuel, whoops, oh no, there's a map on the next slide, sorry. As Victor Emmanuel moves south, as Giuseppe Garibaldi moves north, eventually they meet in Rome. And in Rome, the king, Victor Emmanuel, orders Giuseppe Garibaldi, join me. Join me and together we can rule the empire. Join me, let's unite Italy. Only we can do it together, but I'm gonna be the king. Garibaldi kind of cuts his losses here. He knows he's probably not gonna be able to defeat the king, but he also knows that this will achieve one of his goals of uniting Italy. So he agrees. In 1871, Italy is united as a monarchy. So again, conservative nationalism seems to win. 1871 there again, so that seems to be a key year, 1871. All right, we're gonna pause here for a second because we're kind of done with part one of our lecture. Pause here if you need to. 1848 to 1871 is all about the breakup of the Congress of Vienna, the breakup of the continent of Europe, the breakup of conservative order. And who takes advantage of that? Germany and Italy both take advantage of that, manipulating these new ideologies driven by conservative nationalism to unite as a one German empire, as a one Italian nation, both under monarchs. Pause there if you need to, and then we'll move on. All right, the second part of chapter 16 is on kind of the late 1800s. And so what happens after the Congress of Europe has been blown up, and now that there are some new players on the world stage. For context for the second part, and let me put this on a new page so we're not messed up. The context here, again, the continent of Europe is gone. The continent of Europe has collapsed after the Crimean War. Again, what that means is there's no balance of power, no stability. And so that allows Germany and Italy to unite under a conservative nationalism. Otto von Bismarck leading the charge in Germany to create a German empire. And King Victor Emmanuel, among others, leading the charge in Italy. I should actually add a name real quick. I forgot to mention this. It's led by the King of Sardinia, but it's also led by a guy named Cavour, who was like the foreign minister in Italy. We might see his name. Okay. I want to kind of just jump around and kind of visit each nation in the late 1800s to see what they're up to. First, Austria-Hungary, or Austria rather. Now Austria is all that's left of the old Holy Roman Empire. Remember the HRE, that was the Habsburgs. They used to be like all of Germany, all of Austria, parts of Spain and parts of like the Netherlands, but they've very gradually been collapsing ever since the religious wars in the 15 and 1600s. So by the 1800s, all that's left of the old HRE is Austria. Now, Austria is a really interesting region because Austria is a multi-ethnic region. There are dozens of different ethnic groups, all with their own languages and cultures and sometimes religious practices and customs. You can see here within Austria, there are Germans and Czechs and Slovaks and Poles and Hungarians and Romanians and Serbs and Croats and Slovenes and Italians. And as nationalism gains popularity, all the people within this Austrian Empire, well, they want independence, or at least they want more of a voice. And so Austria has a bit of a crisis here. They realize that, you know, they might not be able to totally put all of these revolutions down. And so the Austrians make a deal with the biggest ethnic minority, the Hungarians, right here. They make a deal with the Hungarians to create a dual monarchy called Austria-Hungary. And in this dual monarchy, there would be one king. There would be one king of Austria-Hungary, but Austria could have their own legislature. Hungary could have their own legislature. Austria would have their own set of laws. Hungary would have a different set of laws. And so the dual monarchy was an attempt to compromise with not all of the ethnic groups in Austria-Hungary, but the biggest one. For the time being, this stabilizes things in Austria-Hungary. It appeases some of the smaller ethnic groups. They get just a little bit of what they want to stop rebelling. So it prevents an immediate war. But all of these other groups, the Serbs especially, they didn't get what they wanted. They're still unhappy. And so they're still going to rebel 40 years later, which will actually start World War I. So what does this do? So Austria-Hungary creates the dual monarchy. So Austria has many small ethnicities within it that want independence. So the dual monarchy allows Hungary to basically have their own Congress and their own set of laws. This prevents immediate war, but I'll just say that ethnic tensions continue. I'm just going to say, for foreshadowing purposes, Serbia is going to lead to World War I. We'll get to that later. Russia, on the other hand, what's Russia up to? Well, Russia, remember, they were humiliated in the Crimean War. They thought the Crimean War was their chance to get a bunch of land and rise to the top of the pecking order in Europe. After they lost the Crimean War, they were humiliated. They withdrew, and they kind of tried to clean up their own shop. The biggest problem Russia had is they were not industrialized, and they were falling behind the rest of Europe, which was industrializing. And so Tsar Alexander II does everything he can to try to quickly allow Russia to rejoin, or to quickly allow Russia to rise up the ranks again. He frees the serfs, basically frees the slaves, but that didn't really do much because the serfs were still incredibly poor and uneducated. He modernized the military and modernized the railway system in Russia. But the problem was that really only benefited the wealthy, the nobles and the aristocracy, because most Russians were still very poor, still uneducated, still relatively unskilled. And so all of these reforms didn't really improve their lives at all. Things didn't get much better for Russia. They lost a war to tiny little Japan in 1905 called the Sino-Japanese War, I believe. After Russia lost this war to Japan, there were protests. Russians basically saying, first of all, like, why'd you lose to Japan? Second of all, why are you going to war? We're starving, like, help us. There's a massive protest outside the Tsar's Winter Palace on what's called Bloody Sunday. The troops opened fire and killed 1,000 innocent protesters. And so Russia is struggling. So Russia, again, they withdraw from world affairs. after the Crimean War. I'll just say that they struggle to industrialize. They lose war to Japan. They have revolutions. And so Russia's really struggling. They're going to go to war 10 years later in World War I, but they've fallen behind. Okay, so Eastern Europe, they're basically struggling to keep up. Now, over in Western Europe, though, there is a new concept called mass politics. Let's think about context for a second. What's going on during the 1800s? Among all the politics and revolutions, this is also the Industrial Revolution. And what is the one big social class that kind of gains more power during the Industrial Revolution? It's the working class. The working class grows in numbers, and eventually they also begin to grow in political power as they realize how big they are, how important they are, and how much power they should have. Now, for most of the 1800s, power was a delicate balance between the traditional elite, the wealthy nobles and aristocrats, and the middle class, the bourgeoisie, the doctors and lawyers and managers of factories and things like that. Because of the Industrial Revolution, though, because of the growth of cities and the growth of factories, the middle class begins to gain more power. And eventually, by the late 1800s, sorry, I just lied to you, the working class gains more power because of factories and new cities and things like that. And as the working class slowly gains the vote and slowly gains more power, this begins to change that delicate balance in politics. For most of recorded history, really, governments only had to answer to the powerful and the wealthy. But now, with this new era of mass politics, where the working class have the vote and the working class are now the majority, the government now has to answer to the masses, to the people, to the working class. So mass politics, again, context here is the working class gains more power. They eventually gain the vote during the Industrial Revolution. And so mass politics is the idea that as the working class gains the vote, governments must serve them and take care of them. If we're thinking about our different isms here, this is going to be liberalism, and this is probably going to be socialism as well, the idea of governments taking care of the people. Let's look at some examples of mass politics. First, France under Napoleon III. Napoleon III was installed as emperor after the revolutions of 1848. He was a conservative nationalist, just like Bismarck was in Germany. He used the strength of the monarchy, conservatism, to strengthen all of France, nationalism. And so what does Napoleon III do? He uses government funds to build railroads and factories and canals, which allows France to rapidly industrialize. He rebuilds Paris with Baron Haussmann. Remember the wide open streets, the big public spaces, things like that. He also knows that he's got to give the working class what they want. So he legalizes trade unions. Workers can now unionize and negotiate for higher pay. He restores universal male suffrage. He gives the working class the vote. And this is really quite brilliant of him because he's still the one in power. He still has complete power, but yet he's incredibly popular. 93% of the French people elect him president. 97% elect him as emperor. Now, the French people didn't really have another alternative. It was basically Napoleon III or chaos, but still. Sorry, so let me get these examples here. So we don't need that bolded. So France under Napoleon III, just so we have time frame here, 1848 to 1871. So he grants the working class some privileges. They get the vote. They can create unions. He also strengthens the economy, builds railroads, helps industrialize France. And so this is a great example of a monarch using some of his power to serve the people, giving them the vote, building them railway lines and things like that. Now, Napoleon III is going to rule until 1871, when France loses the Franco-Prussian War, loses to Germany. And after France loses the Franco-Prussian War, the people, the working class people of France, specifically of Paris, they figure, well, okay, we got rid of that monarch, let's take power ourselves. And so they have another revolution. My God, France. 1789, 1830, 1848, 1871 now. The citizens of Paris create the Paris Commune. Basically hundreds of thousands of French working class people, they take over Paris. And they create basically a socialist government by the people, for the people, I suppose. The Paris Commune works for a few months, but the new French government, they can't stand the people controlling a city. And so eventually the French government, once they kind of get their ducks in line and reform their government, they crush the Paris Commune. They kill over 100,000 French citizens. And so the Paris Commune, let's see here. Give me a second. The working class take over Paris and, I don't know, try to create a socialist state. But ultimately it's crushed by the French government. The Paris Commune is another failed revolution in France. But every time France has a failed revolution, they slowly inch forward, slowly inch towards more progress. But I think the Paris Commune is a really good example because it shows that the governments are really struggling to serve the people's needs. What do governments want? They want control. What do people want? People want, well, food, jobs, and governments sometimes struggle to serve the people's needs. All right. That's one problem in France. France also has a bunch of other problems with the rise of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is basically hatred towards or discrimination against Jewish people, which we'll see explode during World War II with Hitler and the Nazis. Very long story short, there was a political scandal in France in the late 1800s. Dreyfus was a French general, a Jewish French general, and he was accused of selling military secrets to Germany during the Franco-Prussian War. He was put on trial, he was found guilty, and he was sentenced to prison. After the trial was over, it came out that the entire trial was a farce. Fake evidence, fake charges, Dreyfus didn't do anything wrong. And so protests begin to erupt in France. People don't trust the government, number one, but also this exposed anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic feelings. A lot of people didn't trust the Jewish people. And so within France and within the rest of Europe, there's going to begin to be the rise of something called Zionism, which is the Jewish people saying basically, we need our own homeland. It will become the state of Israel. We'll get to those specific stories later, but I'm just going to say that all of these tensions kind of illustrates the tensions between liberals and conservatives. The second half of the 1800s is all about conservatism versus liberalism. Conservatives still have the power, but liberals are gaining more influence and causing a lot of trouble as they demand their rights. Some photographs of the Paris Commune. Let's get these a little bit bigger. Some photographs of the Paris Commune of these massive barricades that they created and the aftermath after the French government rolled in and crushed the rebellion. The last example, actually, we're going to talk about Germany briefly. So the second to last example of mass politics is England under Queen Victoria, sometimes called the Age of Victoria or Victorian England. Queen Victoria ruled from 1837 until 1901. She was the longest serving British monarch until Queen Elizabeth II. who has been ruling England for the last 70 years, since 1950 something. And England, like they oftentimes had been, they were kind of the pinnacle of liberalism in Europe, at least. There's two main things that England did. First, they had many liberal reforms. It says there that there are schools open to all, and then also government jobs are open to all. It's not based on birth or wealth, it's based on your merit. And then England also created several reform bills that gradually gave the vote to all men. 1832, 1867, 1884 gradually gave the vote to all men. This is a victory of liberalism. So again, liberal, I don't know, I'll bold it or something. This is a victory of liberalism, and I'm going to bold the reform bills. You should know some of those. Now, even though, you know, England was probably the most liberal state in Germany, sorry, oh my God, England was the most liberal state in Europe, for many, they didn't go far enough. Specifically, women did not have the vote. The women's suffrage movement really begins to gain a lot of momentum in England and also in the US in the late 1800s, 1848 and on. This was one famous moment where the suffragettes is what they called themselves, people fighting for women's suffrage. This woman right here, you can't really see it. There's a horse and there's a woman right there. There's the horse and there's the woman. At the Queen's Day, it was basically a celebration of the Queen. This suffragette threw herself in front of the Queen's horse and was trampled to death. She committed suicide in front of thousands of people and journalists to show how far women were willing to go to fight for the vote. That woman will eventually get the vote in 1919 and 1920, but again, it's going to take another couple of decades. And women suffragists would oftentimes wear all white as they advocated for the vote. And this tradition of women political leaders wearing white continued. This was in 2019 when several newly elected representatives in the House of Representatives, so in Washington, D.C., wore all white to celebrate the increasing role of women. This is Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC, from New York, who's kind of become a young star of the Democratic Party. All that to say that England has plenty of liberal reforms, but only for men. Women are still being left behind. And then we're going to end with Germany. Germany under Bismarck. Bismarck, remember, is a conservative nationalist. He believes in conservative order, monarchs. But he also knows that he can gain more power by giving the people some of what they want. So Bismarck in Germany, again, he's a conservative nationalist. But he does create some liberal and socialist reforms. He creates social welfare, for example. He creates social security and disability benefits for people who get hurt on the job. And this was a way for him, this was an attempt to win the support of workers. It's going to backfire a little bit because we'll see by 1914, the German Socialist Party controlled a third of the Reichstag, the German Congress. But still, Bismarck is this fascinating leader because he is he's a conservative. He believes in powers for emperors. But he's also a realpolitik. Again, going back to that phrase, realpolitik. He's going to do whatever he needs to do to get power. If that means giving workers some more rights, if that gives him more power, if that makes Germany more powerful, he's willing to do that. So let's pause here if we need to get our notes for the first half. This is the collapse of the Congress of Vienna, which opens the door for Italy and Germany to gain more power. And then the new era of mass politics. As workers gain more power, as workers gain the vote, governments struggle to serve their needs. England does it most successfully, France and Germany with some successes as well.